The water was red, not orange, not brown, red, the color of old brick, moving slowly northward in the pre-dawn dark. And the man standing at the edge of the bank had been watching it for an hour because the color meant something was coming, something that would either feed his family or kill them. He didn't know why the river turned red. Nobody in Egypt did. All he knew was that when it happened, you watched, you counted, you prayed. There was a number, one number that determined whether millions of people would eat or starve. And somewhere upstream, a group of priests already knew what it was, and they weren't telling the Pharaoh. There is a reason Egypt lasted 3,000 years. Not faith, not luck, not the pyramids, something far less poetic and far more extraordinary. The Egyptians learned to read a river that behaved like nothing else on earth, and they built their entire civilization around that reading. But here's what most people miss. The Nile that fed Egypt started in a country Egyptians had never seen, driven by rains they never felt, carrying the soil of mountains they didn't know existed, and once a year, when a single star appeared on the horizon after 70 days of absence, an entire civilization held its breath. This is the story of how ancient Egyptians survived the Nile, and why survived is exactly the wrong word. Picture this. You are standing on the bank of the Nile, somewhere in ancient Egypt, around 1500 BCE. To your left, black soil, rich and dark and wet, already thick with clover and barley, and the smell of mud and life. To your right, you take one step and the ground turns to sand, not gradually, immediately, one step and you are standing in the Sahara. This is what Egypt actually was, not the Egypt of fantasy, golden temples stretching into the horizon, lush and green in every direction. The real Egypt was almost entirely desert. Around 96% of the land was uninhabitable. The entire civilization, every city, every farm, every monument, every person was crammed into a narrow strip of ground along the river, in most places less than 24 kilometers wide, in some places even narrower than that. The ancient Egyptians understood this better than we do. They had two words for their country, Kemet, the black land, and Deshret, the red land, black for the dark, fertile silt left by the flood, red for the killing desert on either side. The line between them was so sharp you could stand with 1 foot in each world, 1 foot in civilization, 1 foot in a place that would kill you in days. Everything Egypt ever produced, its art, its religion, its armies, its philosophy, the stones of the pyramids, was grown in that narrow strip. And it was only possible because of one annual event. One river that did something no other major river in the ancient world did quite so reliably, quite so dramatically, and quite so precisely. Every June, the Nile started to rise. It didn't announce itself loudly. It crept. The water level lifted, almost imperceptibly at first. Then the color began to change. The clear, greenish water of the low season started to cloud. Then it deepened, muddy brown, then orange, then something closer to red. The ancient Egyptians believed they were watching the tears of the goddess Isis, weeping for her dead husband Osiris, falling into the river somewhere far to the south and washing northward. What was actually happening was this. Every summer, monsoon rains fell on the Ethiopian highlands, a mountainous region about 6,000 kilometers to the south, with peaks approaching 5,000 meters. Those rains fed the Blue Nile, which during flood season carried 5 times more water than the White Nile. All of that water, loaded with the red-brown volcanic soil of the Ethiopian mountains, flowed northward through Sudan, entered Egypt at Aswan, reached Luxor roughly 2 days later, and arrived near what is now Cairo about 5 days after that. The people of Egypt watched it coming. They didn't know about Ethiopia. They didn't know about monsoons. What they knew was the color of the water, the smell of the air, and the precise timing of a single star. Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, disappeared below the horizon every year for 70 days. When it reappeared, rising just before dawn on the eastern horizon, the Nile was usually days away from flooding. The Egyptians called the star Sopdet, and its return was the signal for everything. It was their new year, their alarm clock, their announcement that the world was about to be renewed. They called the new year Wepet Renpet, the opening of the year. They celebrated it with the same mixture of joy and anxiety that the flood itself inspired, because joy and anxiety were hard to separate when your life depended entirely on a river. If you want to understand how human beings actually built civilization, not the philosophy but the mechanics, this channel is probably worth subscribing to, because that is exactly what we keep exploring here. Just find the button now and then come back. Now here is the part that changes how you think about ancient Egypt. The Egyptians did not simply wait for the river to flood and then farm whatever soil it left behind. They measured it with precision, using a device so politically loaded that knowledge of its readings was kept secret for centuries. The Nilometer. There were nilometers at various points along the Nile, wells or staircases cut into the riverbank, marked with measurements in cubits. As the flood rose, priests recorded the water level and compared it against those marks. And those marks were not just numbers, they were prophecy. If the water rose to between 16 and 18 cubits, the year would be good. Rich soil, plentiful harvest, a stable empire. If the water stayed below 12 cubits, the flood would not reach enough farmland. Famine would come. If the water went above 19 cubits, the flooding would be too violent, destroying dikes and granaries and infrastructure. Famine would come for a different reason. One number, one reading. The fate of millions of people balanced on a mark carved into a stone staircase going down into the river, and the priests kept the readings to themselves. Think about what that means. While the pharaoh was receiving diplomatic envoys and planning military campaigns, the men running the nilometers already knew, weeks before the flood peaked, whether the harvest would be sufficient, whether tax rates needed adjusting, whether civil unrest was coming. University of Hawaii archaeologist Jay Silverstein, who worked at a nilometer site near modern El Mansoura, described them as the interface between the spiritual and the pragmatic, a place where religion and governance fused into one instrument of control. The nilometer was not a measuring device. It was the most politically powerful object in Egypt, and when it gave the wrong reading, everything broke. Around 2150 BCE, something happened that the Egyptians could not explain and could not fix. The floods weakened. Not for 1 year, not for 2. For what appears to have been a decade or more, the Nile failed to reach sufficient levels. The Black Land shrank, crops failed, grain stores ran out. The Old Kingdom collapsed. This was the period that built the Great Pyramids at Giza. And it did not end with a foreign invasion or a political coup. It ended with a river that simply stopped cooperating. Inscriptions from the period describe conditions that are difficult to read even now. Regional governors stopped sending resources to the central government and began hoarding for their own territories. The pharaoh's authority, which rested partly on the idea that the king could maintain cosmic order, the concept Egyptians called ma'at, became impossible to sustain when the river did not rise. The same pattern repeated centuries later. In the Ptolemaic era, researchers tracing evidence from Greenland ice cores and Antarctic ice sheets identified sulfate deposits from massive volcanic eruptions in places like Iceland. Those eruptions threw particles into the upper atmosphere that altered monsoon patterns across Africa and reduced the rainfall feeding the Blue Nile. The river fell short, crops failed, and in Egypt, where tensions between the Greek ruling class and native Egyptians were already high, the famines triggered revolts. The evidence for all of this comes from ancient papyri, from sediment records in the Nile itself, and from ice drilled out of a glacier on the other side of the planet, a volcano in Europe, ash drifting silently across the sky, and in Egypt a number on a stone that would not reach 16. But this is where the story turns, because for most of its 3,000-year history, Egypt did not collapse. It absorbed bad flood years. It built systems that could take the shock. And the most important of those systems was less dramatic than the pyramids, but arguably more consequential. Basin irrigation. Egyptian farmers did not wait passively for the flood. They engineered the landscape around it. They built networks of earthen banks that divided the floodplain into large, enclosed sections. When the flood came, water was directed into these basins through controlled openings. It sat there for 4 to 6 weeks, long enough for the rich silt to settle out and coat the ground. Then the excess water was drained back into the river, and the saturated, silt-covered soil was planted. This was not primitive farming. It was a coordinated system that required community organization across entire regions. Every village had responsibilities: cleaning canals, repairing dikes, regulating when basins opened and closed. Some canals stretched for tens of kilometers. The scale of coordination involved was in some ways more impressive than any single monument Egypt ever built, because it had to be rebuilt and maintained every single year. And for fields too high for the flood to reach naturally, Egyptian farmers used the shaduf, a long wooden pole balanced on a pivot point, with a leather bucket at one end and a counterweight of clay or stone at the other. One person working alone could lift hundreds of liters of water per day from the river to the fields above it. No machinery, no fuel, just a lever and gravity working together. The shaduf appeared in Upper Egypt around 1500 BCE and is still used in some parts of the world today. This was how they pushed the green land beyond what the river could reach on its own. There is something worth pausing on here. The god Hapi, the deity of the annual flood, was not depicted as a warrior or a king. Hapi was shown as an androgynous figure with a rounded belly and large breasts, carrying lotus flowers and fish. Titles included Lord of the Fish and Birds of the Marshes and Lord of the River bringing vegetation, a figure of abundance, of nourishment, something closer to a parent than a ruler. That choice tells you something real about how Egyptians related to the river, not with dominance, not with conquest, with attentive dependence. The flood was not something to be defeated. It was something to be read, measured, accommodated, and respected. You watched the color of the water. You watched for Sirius. You measured the cubits. You built your basins. You dug your canals. You performed your rituals. And then you waited. 3,000 years, 30 dynasties, the same river, the same star, the same number carved in stone, measured again every single year. The man standing at the river's edge before dawn, watching the water turn red, was waiting for the Nilometer reading to come down from the priests. He would find out, eventually, whether the year was going to be a 16 or a 12, whether Hapi had been generous or had held back. Most years, it was enough, and that is the real answer. The Egyptians did not survive the Nile the way you survive a storm, by enduring until it passes. They survived it the way you survive in a long relationship with something larger than yourself, by paying attention, by adapting, by building systems that could absorb the bad years without losing everything, by encoding that knowledge into religion and engineering and calendar and architecture until it became the foundation of a civilization, not survival. Something harder and more remarkable than that. If this kind of history, the actual mechanics of how civilizations worked rather than just the mythology around them, is something you want more of, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and what we explore next might surprise you just as much as this did.